Yeah, hello everybody. Welcome back after short holidays in Germany due to Day of Reformation in the Protestant countries and yeah, Halloween, so to speak. On the next day is holiday in the Catholic states, federal states in Germany. Yeah, global economics, and we are heading for I don't know. Are they up now in the United States? I think so. So one day left to the elections for the presidential, for the Oval Office, and I think maybe we make it, or otherwise I will make a cut so that we will also talk today a little bit about the presidential vote, the voting system in the United States, because it is quite different compared to the German voting system. Anyway, last week then I managed also after the technical problems to show you how to estimate Okun's law. Maybe you can just give me a short feedback. Have you already tried to do it, to download your data and to do the calculations? Has this worked or haven't you done it right now? So because this you are, yeah, uh-huh, yeah, yeah. Okay, so if you have any problems, then give me a feedback and we will manage this. So, yeah, because we were talking about um, Okun's law a lot, so about so-called natural rate of unemployment, where we could say if all the circumstances are quite stable, that still we would have some people unemployed due to frictional and structural unemployment, and that, so to speak, in the long run we will um, face a dependency, not very surprisingly, between unemployment and um, GDP growth, so to speak, also between not directly GDP growth, but between the unemployment, change in unemployment, and the so-called output gap. Yeah, well, and if you remember the magic square, which we have talked about for the especially German economy, but also that this aiming system where we have GDP growth, unemployment, that, yeah, we will find, of course, a dependence between these two measures, and that in general, we would expect that if the unemployment rates are low, that we have high GDP growth rates. But of course, you have also to be careful. For example, go to the former GDR. There you had zero unemployment rates. Because why? Because you just defined that nobody is unemployed. So please have a careful look at your country, but in general, if the labor market is performing quite good, we would expect that also the economy as a whole is performing quite okay. But then we have another very important measure in our economy, and especially if you look at economies which rely on free markets, because on a free market, this diagram you know, supply and demand, these three markets are working via flexible prices. So, of course, also to have a look at prices would be very important and on the development of prices, and therefore we have this target of price level stability. And of course, then we would also expect a dependence between the main performance of the economy measured by, in general, the movement of GDP and the prices and what are the prices are doing. And this we will introduce today. And for this, of course, also we will use the dependence between unemployment and GDP growth. So let's have a look at the dependence between inflation and unemployment. And in general, we do not look at the price level as itself, but we are looking at the relative measure of the inflation rates. So this is the change or the relative change of price level. And for this, you maybe know that in Europe, we have the quite fixed target that the ECB has a target of inflation to stay around 2% in the medium run. But also, if you look at the United States, there, especially in the aftermath of the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve claimed when they had two-digit unemployment rates of about 10, 11%, they said, well, we want to push economy as long as we are back down to unemployment rates of 6%. And therefore, not in that direct way in Europe, but especially in the United States, you could say that more or less you have two economic aims which you want to reach, that you want to reach low-level unemployment and low-level inflation. Well, and from a qualitative standpoint, we could directly see that you have some trade-off between these two aims, because pushing economy would mean, let's go back to our diagram, that especially moving outward the demand curve, so that you are lowering interest rates in order to get a higher volume of credits in order to increase investments. But then you see if you are moving the demand outside, that then, oh, I'm a little bit high, that then also prices would move up. And yeah, and therefore we are looking at these trade-off, and then also we want to talk about some model how we have dependence between prices and quantities. So what we see here in our diagram, so this X is quantity, output we quantity. For output we quite often use the letter Y, but in general it's quantity, and this price level. But in general, our operational variables are not prices and quantities directly, but that we are looking at the inflation rate and GDP growth, so to speak. Okay, and For this, yeah, we remember just how is inflation defined, and inflation is just the relative change of the price level. So if we take the price level today minus the price level yesterday, then we are dividing this by the price level yesterday, and then we obtain the inflation rate. And this we can also write as the proportion between price level today over yesterday and subtracting 1 from this inflation factor, we call it. This is the inflation factor. Well, and then, of course, our decisions, how much I want to invest or how much I want to consume, also very highly depends not only at the numbers today, which I see, for example, in the supermarket, or which numbers has happened in the past. Of course, I'm looking also at that, but then I'm forming also expectations about where will be price level or where will be inflation tomorrow. Remember, high inflation means that money which I'm earning today and, for example, saving for 1 or 2 years will be in real terms be less worth in 2 years when prices have increased, or when prices are increasing very sharply in the next year. So what also matters is expected inflation, and if we want to calculate expected inflation, we just interchange the price level today with the expected price level. So it's just these E for expected. And all other things are defined in the same way. So relative expected change in price level over price level, the actual price level, and here we have the expected inflation factor. Well, and then we are remembering our Okun's law, the connection between the change of unemployment and the output gap. That there we have this negative dependence, and this means that A has to be larger than 0. And now we are putting these two equations together, and for this also we are remembering our macro curves when we were moving from the ISLM model to the ASAD, aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. And for this, remember ASAD, price level, quantity. We had our AD curve from ISLM, and our aggregate supply model. And this aggregate supply meant that we have a positive dependence between the aggregate supply within our economy and the price level. And of course, here also we have to include the expected price level, because when do we have a positive expectation, when we have this positive dependence, it is if we are surprised in our planning in our company that we could sell our goods and services for a higher price than we have expected. Therefore, this difference, actual price level minus the expected price level, if this is a positive number, then we have an incentive to increase our production. So here, in general, positive dependence between price level and output on the supply side of the economy. And in this dependence from the AS curve, we now are feeding in our definition of inflation. So remember, inflation factor is just price level today over price level yesterday, 1 plus inflation, and expected inflation factor is 1 plus expected inflation. Well, and then for this, we can just write PT is, oh, this is not in a place. Then let's go into here. 1 plus PT times PT minus 1. We just multiplying both sides with PT minus 1. And here also, then we obtain 1 plus inflation, expected inflation times PT minus 1. Well, and this we feed in here, and this one we feed in here. And then we end up potential output times our proportionality factor A. Of course, this small a also has to be larger than 0 in order to obtain the positive dependence between output and price level. And now in the brackets, we have 1 plus inflation times price level yesterday minus 1 minus expected inflation times price level yesterday. This we have in both terms of our difference, so we can take it out in front of the bracket. This we have here. And then you have 1 plus pi t minus 1 minus pi expected t. So the ones are canceling out, and we obtaining a similar dependence between output and now not price level, but the difference of inflation minus expected inflation. Well, and then we have this new factor, price level yesterday times our proportionality factor. Well, but price level yesterday, we know, and this then we can take as a fixed number. So we have our parameters small a times a number we are knowing from history. So both together within our model, we can describe then also as just one parameter. And this new parameter I call a tilde. So here now if we take yt, we have a new dependence between output and inflation. So we are just interchanging in our diagram what we are knowing from our introductory course in macro, AS curve, output depending on price level is now in a similar way, only we have another slope of our line, but now we have a dependence between inflation and output. But still, of course, a tilde is also larger than 0. So still we have this increasing dependence between output and inflation. So increasing dependence between output and inflation. This curve we now call AS prime. Well, let's go on. Now, as I said, we are taking Orkun's law. And there, in general, we have here the output gap. But we want now to take our AS curve, now independence of inflation, together with Orkun's law. And for this, we are multiplying here both sides with our potential output. So this we put in front of here. And then we have A times Y star. But remember, potential output is a long-term concept. This was business cycle, T, GDP. This was this long-term trend potential measured via potential output. But now we are looking in shorter periods. Change of price level today versus price level yesterday, and in generally we are looking at price level or inflation this year versus inflation last year. Within our model, we are looking now in a development in short or medium terms. Within our model, we are looking at developments in short or medium terms. But y star potential output is a long run variable. And then compared to our short-term and medium-term periods, we can treat y star also as a fixed number or only as a number which is changing on a very low level. So, and therefore, we can treat within our model y star as a fixed number. So here short and medium, this is long, and therefore we can assume that y star within our model is not changing, and therefore A, capital A times y star is also not changing. And this we set then similar to pt minus 1 times small a as a new fixed number. We now assume that capital A times y star is a fixed number. So we obtain this new, or not this new, but just this rewritten dependence. And then also we are subtracting, not subtracting, we add on both sides potential output, and then we end up in the new version of Okun's law, potential output minus capital A tilde times relative change of unemployment, unemployment today relative to natural rate of unemployment. Remember, U star natural rate of unemployment. This is the corresponding unemployment rate if we are growing at trend at potential the growth of potential output. Well, and then we have here our y star, but y for y star, not y star, yt. Our output today, we have derived this dependence from our AS curve. So on the right-hand side, we are putting in for this yt now our AS curve. And what we see then is this is the AS curve from the former slide. We have on both sides potential output. This cancelled. And now we have translated our dependence of unemployment and GDP in a dependence of unemployment and inflation. Well, then we can divide both sides by small a tilde. then we obtain A tilde, capital A tilde over small a tilde. Both are fixed numbers. So of course, dividing two fixed numbers is a new fixed number. And in order not to write that much, we redefine the proportion between capital and small a as a new fixed number, which we call beta. And then, if this is beta, and when we add on both sides expected inflation, we obtain the following equation, that inflation today is the expected inflation formed by the economic agents minus a positive fixed number, proportionality factor, times the difference between unemployment and the natural rate of unemployment. And this is also a very famous dependence found also just by looking at data by an economist called Phillips, also around when Aukun's law was found in the 1950s, in the 1960s in the United States, where he also just looked at the development of inflation and the development of unemployment, and then he found a negative dependence between the development of inflation and the development of unemployment. Negative, here we have this minus sign. So in general, no, not for the United States, he did his analysis for UK, and he just found in the data was also found a negative dependence between inflation and unemployment. And therefore, this negative dependence is called the Phillips curve. And then this was further developed, especially by Edmund Phelps, later on by Lucas, and for their examination and for their theoretical explanation of these dependence between inflation and unemployment, they obtained in the midst of the 80s after, no, not in the midst of the 80s, here in the around 2000, but Lucas, I think he obtained the Nobel Prize a bit earlier. But also the look at this dependence is, of course, a very important one between within an economy. Remember when I introduced it that central banks are looking mainly on inflation. What kind of impact has to look at inflation to try to manipulate inflation rates in the future? What kind of impact this will have on the economy? This can be quite good explained by this dependence between inflation and unemployment. And this is called the Phillips curve. Well, let's have a look how this dependence, which we derived from our classical ASAD model and Aukun's law, what this would mean. And for this also, in order to be a little bit more realistic, we add a so-called supply shock within our model that we just adding this epsilon. This can be positive or negative. So a positive shock would, of course, push our economy, and this in general, think of yeah, that the people within our economy would have, everybody would have has more money, that then demand also would shift outside, and this would shift prices. So positive epsilon means that inflation would go up. So putting this in our diagram now, what do we see? We see this negative dependence between inflation and unemployment. And this is now very important. This means we have a trade-off between these two aims within our aim system in the economy: unemployment and price level stability. Here we want to have a low one, and here we want to have a low one. But now, if we have a negative dependence between these two, we cannot achieve simultaneously, if our model holds, low inflation and low employment. But on the other way, and this is very nice for the politicians, we could also say, well, if we are boosting inflation, then this would mean, so to speak, riding on the Phillips curve. If we are boosting inflation, this would mean our unemployment goes down. So trade-off, we cannot achieve both aims simultaneously, but on the other hand, a boost of inflation would lower unemployment. Well, in Europe, and also not at this high level as in Europe, we have independent central banks, and therefore, quite often, politicians say, please just push prices, because then the probability that I will be re-elected because of low unemployment rates would be higher. And if you do not have independent central banks, then this, of course, is done. Look, for example, to Turkey. There, Erdogan is, of, although they had already very high inflation rates, he said, well, please go on pushing the economy in order to get low unemployment rates. Well, this would be then very nice. So we only have to push inflation and then low unemployment. But what we also have to keep in mind that here we have this very crucial point that we do not have only the dependence here between inflation and unemployment, but that also, so to speak, our longer term parameters, natural unemployment, this proportionality factor, and expected inflation, these are the parameters which say us where is our curve are lying in our diagram. These parameter, not this one, sorry. These parameters determine the position of the Phillips curve. And especially this parameter says us, is our Phillips curve lying more inside the diagram, low expected inflation rates, or is it lying outside in our diagram? Well, and now we have to think what we have done, why we could have fixed some numbers within our model, because we said, well, we are looking at the short-term, maybe medium-term development. And therefore, we could set some numbers, especially our expectation within this short-term view as fixed. That in general, we say, well, we assume inflation rates would be around 2 or 3% for the next 3-4 years. But what happens if these expectations are changing due to our experiences? For example, if our politicians always said, well, let's please push inflation. Well, then maybe they are coming, our economic agents, from low expectations about inflation, and then they are learning, and they learn, well, in the last 5-6 years, my expectations always were wrong. And then I redo my expectations and say, well, for the last 5 years, I thought around 2 or 3% of inflation. But for the next 5 years, I reset my expectations of inflation now maybe to 5%. And what means this? This means that my Phillips curve is moving outside. And this I show here in this diagram. That maybe we start at this level, then in our economy, inflation was pushed. We were riding in the short run. In the short run, the Phillips curve 1. But then economic agents recalculate their expectation inflation to a higher number, and this would mean Phillips curve moves outside or shifts outside, and now the higher short-term inflation rate will be our new expected inflation rate. And if this goes on over time, our Phillips curve with its negative slope, blue lines, will turn into a vertical curve in a long-term perspective. So if this goes on over time, Phillips curve becomes vertical. So this is then the long-term Phillips curve. Well, and actually, such an argumentation we have had already. Remember your introductory course in macroeconomics. There we also said ASAD model, price level and output, ASAD. There, this was medium term AS curve, and there we also argued, well, in the long run, the output within our economy is determined by the framework, by our structural infrastructural positions, how much resources do we have, how good is our society educated, and that we would have a long run supply curve. And more or less, we have here the same argumentation or qualitatively similar argumentation that, so to speak, our economic agents, they learn over time from history. Well, if our politicians always are pushing the economy via high inflation rates, then I will learn this, then I will expect high inflation rates, and then I could not be surprised. Also, my firms in my economy could not be surprised, and they will push their output only if they are surprised by the actual price level relative to their expected price level. And if I have learned this, then high inflation rates will not push anymore or will not lower anymore our unemployment rates, and then we will just stay in the long run over time at this natural rate of unemployment. In the long run, we cannot lower unemployment via high inflation rates. Well, hopefully you could follow my argumentation, but of course, a model is only a good model if we find this also within the data. And for this, I again, because there we have since World War II very good data in the United States, I moved in the United States data, and actually we find within the United States these outward shift of the Phillips curve. So here we are in the 1960s. See, there we have this dependence that we could stabilize the economy in the United States starting from 1968, and then you see here 63, 64, 65. We are, so to speak, riding on these stable for the short term, medium term Phillips curve. So the inflation rate becomes higher, and simultaneously the unemployment rate came down. But what happened then? Well, in the 1970s, so to speak, the economic agents have learned, and in the 1970s, we find that, well, these red points we cannot still fit with this blue line, but they fit in a better way a more outside lying Phillips curve. So movement outside. And then again, in the end of the 1970s, we moved even more outside the green points, the gray points. And then to the 80s, even much more. So all this outside moving Phillips curve. So we really find the dependence which we have explained theoretically on the two former slides. Well, in this case, I didn't fit a linear line because this wouldn't really fit our data, but I just fit an exponential function. And yeah, the nice thing of an exponential function to fit is that in general, yeah, we quite often look in economics on elasticities. Hopefully you have also talked about elasticities in your introductory courses in mathematics, statistics, business administration, and so on. And this means if you take an exponential dependence between two variables, this means that the elasticity is constant. And if you remember, within Excel, when you have fitted Okun's law, you could also just choose from linear to exponential dependence. And this I did here in this case. So this is actually quite nice because we really can see this shift outside, which we have argued here on a theoretical basis. Well, but then there happened something what is not that nice. Also in the 1980s, we had still this argued dependence, negative dependence. But what then happened in the 1980s? Dependence between unemployment and inflation turned in the other direction. Well, and maybe this we can explain by the drastic change in the 1990s, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the economic more or less collapse of the Soviet Union, and all this change that also then our general dependencies between the macroeconomic variables also break down. Because of course also we still have to keep in mind that our model then functions if we have more or less stable circumstances. And therefore, here, especially in the 1990s, we have, so to speak, no stable Phillips curve, where we have argued that we have a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And then, yeah, somehow this in the with the start of the new millennium, this dependence again started in the way of the Phillips curve, that after that we could see that we more or less in the beginning of the 2000s of the new millennium, we came back to something what we can call a classical stable Phillips curve. But then again, we had this large turmoil within the financial crisis and also Corona crisis, that we have again a breakdown of the Phillips curve dependence in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Look especially here, these are the green points. We have a very low R squared with only 0.2. Well, and then within Corona and the aftermath of Corona, but there we have only very less data, and this also includes Corona, that we have somehow a quite high R squared for the last 3 years. But on the other way around, well, the less data you have, of course, in general, the higher will be your R squared. Because, of course, then in general, you wouldn't have this large fluctuation around your fit. So since we have only 4 data points, we cannot really rely that we already have a stable dependence, but it is more or less a hint between, again, more or less stable dependence between unemployment and inflation rates. Because also if we look at the economy, the last 2 years where we had these inflation rates, then uh, especially the Federal Reserve stepped in and unemployment rates came down. But of course, you have to be careful because we have only 4 data points. And for doing statistics, of course, the main thing is that you have a large data set. Yeah, in order to summarize this, then we could say, in general, we can, in the short term, medium term, move on a more or less stable Phillips curve, but then we should not be surprised that the agents recalculate their expectations, and in general, we will have a shift outside, so that if we take a long-term perspective, that in a long-term perspective, as we had it with the long-term AS curve, that we would have also a long-term Phillips curve, that we then have this shift or rotation. So, and this then, what a pity for our politicians. If we try to write on our Phillips curve in order to reduce unemployment also, so always surprising our economic agents, always surprising our society, would end up in a vertical Phillips curve. Well, and what will we then have? We will still have quite high unemployment rates, but in parallel, high inflation rates. And this is not a very nice situation within our economy. This we call stagflation. And such a thing, more or less, we had more or less in the 1980s. And well, we were in somehow a situation like this 1 or 2 years ago. Yeah, this is what I wanted to tell you about this classical dependence between inflation and unemployment and the performance of our economy. And we have some time left, and therefore I also want to talk with you about the presidential vote, which we will have tomorrow in the United States on Tuesday. And yeah, maybe you already know this, but maybe this is also quite new for you, that in the United States we have a different kind of voting system compared to our voting system in Germany. Because what is in Germany? In Germany, all votes of the whole country are counted, and then we, so to speak, go to the parliament, and the party which have the most votes also obtains the most seats within the parliament. So the proportion of votes translates into the number of seats in Parliament. Well, but in the United States, voting for the president, this is counted in another way because we are looking only at the first time at the federal states. There, everybody has one vote. Also, we have the principle one man, one vote. So every voter votes in their states. And then every state has a number of people sitting in the so-called electoral college. So every state, and then we have that Washington, D.C., the capital, is also treated like a state, sends a fixed number of electors to these electoral college. And what now happens is that if you have in general in one federal state the majority of votes, then you take all the electors of your state into the electoral college. Let's just see the numbers for example Pennsylvania. Electoral votes Pennsylvania. How much do we have? Let's have a look. Where is it? Consent. Here. Maybe we can take this. Oh, where do I have it? Oh, can I cut this? Where do I have this? Anyway, you see it here, and where's Pennsylvania? This one, North Carolina, Virginia. Where is Pennsylvania? Kentucky. Oops. There, 19. This is Pennsylvania. So 19 electoral votes, and this means if Kamala Harris or Donald Trump will have the relative majority within these states, and also only if they have one more vote within the state, then all of these 19 electoral votes go to Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. Although maybe, or this will be, because this is one of the swing states, will be there will be a very close race. You have this principle in general, the winner takes it all. Well, and this is in almost all federal states the case. Well, you have three exceptions in Maine and Nebraska, and there you have a slight slightly other rules, that there you have some relative majority vote, or that you have here a runoff election to the successive winner within this federal state. But in general, keep in mind you have this, the winner takes it all, no matter if there is a close race or not. Well, one maybe nice thing compared to Germany, where we have now a large problem in the political system because we have not anymore, so to speak, large parties. The CDU and the SPD has a little bit more than 20% right now, and therefore we have to build coalitions. Right now we have three parties in Germany, but if you take this winner takes it all principle, then of course you just get only this split. One wins and the other one loses. But now you can think of the situation if one guy of the presidential race wins, so to speak, his electoral or her electoral votes only in very close races in the federal states, winner takes it all principle, and the other one takes the electoral votes in, yeah, very high majorities, then calculating all votes in the country could end up with a situation that the winner in the electoral votes is not the winner counting all votes in your country. And this actually has happened two times in the recent history, that in 2004, Al Gore, here in the popular vote, has won the race by 0.4%, while, and this was then a very close race, especially in Florida. And if we go to this here, you see Florida, if you have here a quite close race, this could be highly decisive due to the large number of electoral votes, that this meant winning Florida just recalculates the result of the vote that George W. Bush has won the presidential race. And also, and here it was even more in the race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, that 2016, even Hillary Clinton had 2 percentage points more than Donald Trump, because especially in the Rust Belt around the Great Lakes, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and so on, Donald Trump has a very headed off in a very large way by 15 percentage points because he won all these very close states. Well, and one last thing is very interesting, that if you look who voted then in the next campaign, 2020, relatively more for Biden, for the Democrats, it was not the case that really Trump voters switched to Biden, but if you look at it, let's take another color. Oops, where is it? No. That, although in general you just say you are voting only for Democrats or Republicans in the United States, in general, in the system, you will have also some other presidential candidates, but they obtain only very small number of votes. But in the Trump campaign, there, especially for some, you would call it in Germany, green presidential candidates, they obtained 6% of the votes. And more or less, you can say the switch from 2016 to 2020 was only that these candidates now, or these voters now voted not anymore for the candidates, for these green candidates, but they switched to Joe Biden in this time. Well, and therefore, I think this is the reason that we again have this very, very close race, because now you do not have this potential anymore. Or we could maybe say that this will be the thing. That now I'm done for today, and I again have this problem. Let's see if I think you still hear me. Let's see if I can. Yes, you hear me still, because my can fix this by changing this. Yes, it still worked. It was only frozen. Only my picture is gone, but this is not a large problem. So this also, and I stop the recording.